using fiction to talk about Bitcoin, and I suppose in a wider sense, Austrian economics or libertarian values, sort of freedom technology, futuristic sci-fi and fiction is a great way. And at the moment, Spain is being heralded as an economic wonder because its GDP is growing by sort of 0.5%. You come and speak to people on the street and say, is your life, 0.5% better than last year? They're not seeing that growth. We're at, 5-6% adoption, or where the internet was in 1999, 2000. There were still people back then saying, why do I need the internet? But in terms of the value that you bring to the table as a writer or a creator, AI would be pretty impressed about the stuff you can do that it can't. I believe that human writing will continue. I believe that books will continue to be incredibly important. And I think Bitcoin is such a fantastic example of like a niche. Bitcoiners read so many books.
I saw even that you had a channel on how to write in English, like where you help people in writing, which is super interesting. I have to check it out because I'm not an author. I'm not doing any books or something like that. But I feel like writing is really cool to craft your own thoughts and get it down on paper. So I'm getting more and more into writing my thoughts just out on paper or like on the computer. That's really cool what you do there.
Yeah, there's a lot of crossover with, all of my different incarnations. But, a couple of years ago until fairly recently, I was, mainly coaching multilingual writers. And that means, writers who use English as a second language, but have a very high level of English and often, are professional or published writers. And, my sort of journey has been going from sort of advertising to English teaching to writing and then to helping writers and now to, writing and working in Bitcoin. So it's been quite the journey, but it's cool that many of these things still overlap. And, I meet Bitcoiners from around the world who, like yourself, English isn't your first language, but, here we are speaking English, using English to spread the good word of Bitcoin. So that's
like English is the standard as hopefully Bitcoin will be at one point, at least as I see it.
Yeah, I was actually talking on a podcast a couple of weeks ago about how Bitcoin it could be considered a language, and there's a lot of similarities between Bitcoin and languages in the way that there is. Perhaps I was saying that the English language especially is a bit more malleable, a bit more changeable than Bitcoin, which is like, the idea is not to change it, right?
Interesting. How do you see Bitcoin as a language? Like how did you draw that comparison between Bitcoin and being a language?
It was actually Daniel, I think it's called Daniel Van Weel. Forgive me if I got your name wrong, Daniel, but another podcaster, and he drew the analogy. I can't remember exactly why it was. I do remember that I saw on somebody's LinkedIn profile that they'd written proficient in Bitcoin in as a language. They said, I speak English, like German and Spanish and Bitcoin. I thought, that's good. I'm going to steal that. So I suppose it's that many people can learn it and use it, and it has several different use cases. It's like a sort of tree, language is often referred to as a tree, and they're interconnected and linked and sprout into different uses. But I suppose at the root of the tree would be like Bitcoin core, right?
Yeah, there's like two things to that. Like obviously, like a programming language is definitely for me a language, but also like Bitcoin itself, when you use it, it's sort of a language where you have always an address communicating a value to another address, and it's very similar to what language is trying to communicate. Like we are transporting one thing to another, and language is kind of the transport layer for that, and Bitcoin also is just transporting information in the raw sense of it. I never looked at it that way, but it makes sense.
I think another interesting point about language, and especially with AI coming into things, is that passes information which is there, words which are there, which can be formulated and tabulated and brought into existence. A lot of writing, especially, but language and communication is done sort of between the words. There's a lot of information which we can impart by what is not said, what's implied, by meanings which can't be defined as one thing. And I guess that's another difference between, programming language, which is binary, and linguistic language, which is, much less so.
It's probably really hard to put the right words in a book to make the point that you really want to make. It's probably way easier in an audiobook. I guess in an audiobook you have the component of the voice also, and in a written book you kind of have to imagine how's the author kind of intended to do that.
Yeah, I think it depends on your personality and your strengths. I know many writers who are absolutely terrified of, appearing on video, public speaking, all that kind of stuff. So they're used to expressing themselves only in a written sense with a long period of time. And I guess now, myself included, writers have to be a bit more public facing and sort of be happy to build an audience and, use social media and put themselves out there, because otherwise, we don't have anyone to speak to or to write to.
Interesting that kind of the social media forces writers to be more content creators than they used to be.
Yeah, I mean, you're in the same boat, I suppose, with podcasting. Like, it's fantastic that anyone in the world can start a podcast, but that doesn't mean that the most successful podcasters are just lucky. Is because they've hit upon the right formulas to build an audience and to deliver valuable, content to them. And it's exactly the same with writing. Anyone can write, anyone can publish, but that means there's a lot of competition. And really now it's about building an audience more than writing well. Doesn't really matter sort of what you write, as long as people are listening. That's kind of the modern way of it.
And it's also interesting because I have now this podcast. I have now over 400 guests on my podcast. And every time I go to a presentation, go to like a public event, go to somewhere where like I meet in person and people know about my podcast, people usually ask me what I want to do with my podcast. And they usually also ask do you plan to make articles? Do you plan to make books around the podcast? Because you have so much information with all the different guests, like literally over 400 different guests that talk about one specific topic of Bitcoin, but there are like a lot of information in there, a lot of things that you can do with that. And they kind of I would not say force me to do that, but they kind of ask so much that it's so present in my head that I could write a book with the podcast. Where I'm like, okay, like I'm no writer at all. Like I failed German classes, I failed English classes. I had to repeat the class because of English, and now I'm speaking English every day as my profession. So I'm really bad with language. I'm really bad with grammar. I often make grammar mistakes in the title or like in the description. People point that out to me. People also make fun of like how I pronounce certain words, just because like language is actually not my strength, which is funny because now I'm a podcast host and I'm earning my money with speaking. But I'm getting more and more warmed up to the idea that I actually write a book. And my first step towards that is that I actually just write down my thoughts and draft my things. And it's an interesting journey. It pushes me out of my comfort zone because I rather just sit down and talk. So I rather do the thing that authors might not like to do, just be out there in video and then just talk. And for me, it's really hard to like just sit down and write, but it really changes how your mind works and how you think about things. And I do enjoy that process already.
Well, I think when you've experienced enough of a journey, which is, similar to a story, which has a beginning, middle, and it's, there's some kind of change, realization, of course, Bitcoin is that for many people, but personal stories I think are very underutilized. Like, how many books about Bitcoin do we have? Many, and they're brilliant. They're well worth reading. I've read most of them, and maybe not most of them, but a lot of them. But they're really just framing a complex topic in a different way, and that may reach a new audience. I've just been reading The Big Print by Larry Lepard, and I think that's a good example, right, of a book which I'm not sure it says anything incredibly different to what's been said before or new, but it uses a bit of his personal life and his personal experience, and it certainly will reach a new audience because he's a TradFi guy, he's an older guy, and I'm sure many of his contacts and people that he's worked with throughout his career will, discover something about Bitcoin through the book. But yeah, what was I saying? That there are maybe too many books about Bitcoin and explanations and guides and such. And, my ethos is I'm not a technical guy. I'm not somebody who's drawn to Bitcoin because I want to know how Lightning works and want to run a node. That's not me. I am more emotive and I like stories and that's what captures my interest. And I think the next billion people that are onboarded to Bitcoin, that's how they get there, is through hearing a personal story which sparks their interest. One which keeps cropping up, I don't know his name, but he's the Welsh guy who lost his laptop in a landfill, in like a rubbish tip. And every 3 months or so, the story develops more. There's like a new news article about his fight with the city council to try and search through the tip to get his laptop back. That story I kind of think is often brought up by legacy media because they want to sort of laugh at a guy who's having to sift through rubbish and like, haha, crypto bro has lost his coins and like he's been knocked down, and 10 years later he's still crying about losing 600 million euros or whatever. But it goes to show that like people are interested because it's a real person who's searching for treasure in the dump, and like he had it all and he lost it. Like there's something about that story which is just so engaging that it keeps coming back up. And my hope is that we get different stories and some more positive stories coming out as well. And that's my sort of mission too.
Interesting. The personal story toucher. And you're totally right. There's so many books about Bitcoin, and also like completely right there. There are two facets of Bitcoin books. There is always the problem with the fiat system, and then there's the solution, which is then Bitcoin. And this is probably the two main things that are always described in Bitcoin textbooks, and they put it in a different frame all the time. Fun enough, the previous guest to you actually was Larry Lepard talking about the Bitcoin book. So that it's really funny that you bring him up without knowing that he was the previous guest, because it's still not published. So you have no way of knowing that.
Hi Larry, I read your book. Liked it.
Really cool. The world is sometimes small, but yeah, it's that is very true, and super interesting. I just had the thought of my sister in mind actually, where I'm like, there's no way in hell I can convince her of reading The Big Print. Like, no way. Like, I will give it to her. She will probably read the first 5 pages and like, what do I do with that book? Not because it's not a good book. It's an amazing book. Like, it describes it really, really good, I think. But also like with the Bitcoin Standard, which is also an incredible book. And I think it's almost like a Bitcoin Bible. And I think almost every Bitcoiner probably has read that one book. But what probably piques her interest more because she's really into novels, really into like stories. Like she doesn't read that many textbooks. So a book where it's a novel and it's a personal story someone who found Bitcoin and it's really intriguing, where like his life story is kind of in the forefront and Bitcoin is just like one part of that story, or maybe like even a futuristic story where it just plays in the year 2140 and it describes how Bitcoin world works. And I think those books, there are not that many books of those, like 21 Futures, and we should talk about also what you were doing then. But like those are really rare cases, and I think you're absolutely right. We need more of those to hand out to people and gather a whole new audience in that way. I like the way of thinking.
Thanks. Yeah, I think my mission is a bit longer term, and it's with some people it will be more softly, with some people it will be more direct, but being too direct is the issue. I think with X being such a strong community and Bitcoin being such a strong, supportive, but insular community, Bitcoiners have learned to speak to each other by saying things like study Bitcoin. You go up to somebody on the street and say, excuse me, you should study Bitcoin. They'll be like, why? Why should, like, you may as well say study rocket science or study, crop rotation in the Middle Ages or something. Like, nobody cares. So the only people who do care are people who are, already curious and keen to know more about the technical side of solutions to problems that they might already be aware of. Like you said, there's the problem and then the solution side. So most people don't want to study Bitcoin and they won't listen. If you go to somebody on the street and say, have you heard that there is a man in Wales routing through a rubbish tip every day? He's trying to buy the landfill site from the council so that he can recover $600 million on a hard drive. Some people might be like, that's interesting. Tell me more. I'm involved in the story. Now, I guess some people might say, oh, well, he's a stupid crypto bro. Or, oh, I don't care. That's his business. And you may have to take a more softly approach. And like you said, with, there are ways where you can frame a story using fiction that doesn't even mention Bitcoin. I suppose Star Trek is a great example of a sci-fi series and a series of movies that bring up societal issues like, race problems and, wars between countries without explicitly saying, this is what we're teaching you, this is what we're telling you, this is what we're making you think about. And I think that's really the idea of using fiction to talk about Bitcoin, and I suppose in a wider sense, Austrian economics or libertarian values, so freedom, technology, futuristic sci-fi and fiction is a great way to do that, because you can really take things to an extreme degree. You can have things happening in outer space or so far in the future that a new technology exists, which is really exciting. But I hope and I think that that will touch the hearts and get people thinking about these issues. It certainly does for me.
What inspired you to write the book? I think 21 Future it's called, right?
Yeah, I suppose, being honest, two things. And it's an interest. I don't know if I've told the truth of it all before, so this is like an exclusive to the Rob and Seyr podcast. In my coaching work, I talked a little bit about helping multilingual writers. I worked with a client, Nico Larmanen. Shout out to Nico. He runs Consensus Network. And he basically orange pilled me. I knew absolutely nothing about Bitcoin and was helping him go through some articles and thoughts on book writing. And I became interested in Bitcoin. He was very good and softly orange pilled me by just sending me books and saying, "Hey, have a look at that." And I read several books. Knut Svanholm, I think, was probably one of the first Bitcoin books I read. A few months later, I had an idea to create an anthology with a publisher in the UK. So an anthology is a collection of short stories, fiction, from different authors, and they're collated and put into a book, usually on some kind of theme, right? So you might have a horror anthology, or this one was about cities around the world. And the publisher kind of knocked me back, or didn't really take me very seriously. And I thought, I want to put an anthology out. And then I thought, hey, I know a publisher. And how can I sell something to this publisher? Well, it's got to be something new. And there had been, and I'm writing about this more now and putting together some articles on Bitcoin fiction. There had been, fiction books which not only mentioned Bitcoin, but were about Satoshi or about, the birth of Bitcoin. But there hadn't been a sort of book set in the Bitcoin verse, as I call it, like a universe in which it makes up a large part of the economy. People are using it as a medium of exchange. It may be sometime in the future. I went to Nico with this idea, and 21 Futures was born. I thought, let's really go with 21. We can have 21 stories from different authors. And I managed the project. The first book, Tales from the Time Chain, came out in December 23. And we're on track to publish the second book very soon, probably about the time this podcast airs.
I partnered up with Coin Vigilante. This is the most beautiful Bitcoin timepiece that I ever saw created by anyone. Look at that beauty. I love it so much. Coin Vigilante made a perfect Bitcoin watch. That's the perfect, subtle, elegant way to go out there and show that you are a Bitcoiner. And that watch brand is Bitcoin only. And Coin Vigilante just dropped a completely new and amazing Genesis edition of their watch collections. You have the date of the first ever mined Bitcoin block in there, and of course also the block height and which epoch we are currently in. I love the level of detail they put in this masterpiece, and make sure to check out those amazing Coin Vigilante timepieces down in the descriptions. I love those watches so much. If you watch or listen to my podcast on a regular basis, I guess you already bought some Bitcoin. And now the most important step is to keep the Bitcoin. Keep them secure in a hardware wallet. My personal recommendation for hardware wallet is the BitBox. It's super secure. It's simple to set up. It's also a perfect gift for a friend who has still the Bitcoin on an exchange. And you can get a 5% discount with the code Robin at the checkout. Visit bitbox.swiss/Robin to get your BitBox. And the next step is to really level up your sovereignty as an individual. You have to have the most secure self-custody setup. You have to secure your own devices. You have to protect your privacy. You have to set up an inheritance plan. And depending on where you live, you even want to have a plan B, a citizenship where you can move in case something goes really wrong. And through all those steps, the Bitcoin way is guiding you through step by step. And if you visit thebitcoinway.com/partners/Robin, you even get a 30-minute free call to find out how you can level up your sovereignty.
Like there's Tales of it, but 21 Futures is an own book, right?
So 21 Futures is sort of like the brand. It's the platform. If you visit 21futures.com, you can read reviews, interviews, original fiction, different, blogs, and even listen to some of the authors talking about their work. So 21 Futures is sort of the overarching brand and theme of freedom fiction. Actually, the second book, Financial Fallout, is not specifically about Bitcoin, about financial dystopias, which often include the solution, right? But thanks for showing that. Great. So that's the first book. The second book is coming out very soon.
Really cool. I love that financial fallout. I love the cover. Really cool.
Yeah, it looks great, doesn't it? So head over there if you want to read more fiction and stories. We may have some videos and audio coming soon as well. And another part of 21 Futures, which is this website is still a little bit in the works, as you can see, but there's more coming soon. And if anyone out there is a writer interested in submitting fiction for the site or for our next anthology, then head over to 21futures.com and check it out, because really this mission is only possible because of the great help that we've received from other authors and through so many people in the community spreading the message. So we really want more people to come on board and share, their vision of what the future may be.
What is the tales from the time chain about? Is it like a fictional world where it described how Bitcoin's world looks like, or?
So the mandate for 21 for Tales from the Time Chain, which is our first anthology, it has 21 different stories in which we sourced from lots of different authors who were invited. Some of them were invited to contribute. Some of them responded to our call for submissions. The mandate for that was not stories about Bitcoin, but stories in which Bitcoin plays a role. So, we didn't want, who is Satoshi Nakamoto or Satoshi's on the run, or we didn't want stories yet about somebody who invented something world-changing, more about characters who, for whatever reason, were in danger. We had stories set in Algeria, in outer space, in the future. We actually had like a fantasy story from Yoni Appleberg as a sort of set in a fictional past. But it was, really the mandate was not stories about what Bitcoin is or how it works or why it's important, but stories in which it plays some kind of role, helps a character, maybe even hinders a character. Of course, there's a lot of dangers with, associated with owning Bitcoin as well. So we had some stories which were more happy, and maybe stories which were more dystopian.
I love that. We need those stories, and it also crafts. It kind of gives something to think about. Really cool. How did you? You already told a little bit that Nico was also already on the podcast. How Nico orange pilled you, but what made it click for you? Like when you read the books, when you read the things, what made it so like, oh, okay, Bitcoin could be something really, really good?
Yeah, I hope this will be of interest to your listeners, and that they will have if they have a vastly different experience. I think my experience is probably similar to a way a lot of normies nowadays will get orange pilled, and that is, I had no technical background. I don't care about C++ and Lightning nodes and things. I don't have a financial background. If you would ask me what's the difference between a security and a commodity and an equity and stuff 2-3 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to tell you. So it's been a big learning experience. What made it click was, I think Nico was writing an article about inflation, and it was, at the point post-COVID where inflation had really ramped up to sort of 20%. And I realized I didn't really understand why inflation happened, and I just accepted that it did happen. So I suppose that was one of the rabbit holes of just understanding that there is a type of money which has a fixed supply and a type of money which doesn't. And one of them is screwing you over. And I think actually somebody pointed me towards the Another book that I edited pointed me towards the Bank of England, the central bank for the UK, their website. And there's a bit of it that says, what is inflation? And it doesn't describe what inflation is at all. It just skirts around the issue and says, when prices go up and stuff like that. It's like the central bank is just openly lied to. So inflation was the answer of what really blew the top off my sort of, don't know if that's the right analogy, but it removed the blinkers from the sort of fiat world that I was living in, and got me curious enough to start asking questions. And I think that's a great starting point for a lot of people.
I just Googled it to see how they describe it, and they basically just show CPI. And for them, CPI is inflation. Maybe I can also show that. They just go of like, what's the rate of inflation? What is inflation? And then it's just like, like CPI and the target 2%. Like it's literally just then an advertisement for what the central bank is kind of wanting to have. That's crazy. Yeah. But I think it's probably all of the banks sites probably describe it in that way. And unfortunately, also all the economics books, they are usually written like that. They don't talk about inflation being the monetary expansion or being caused by the monetary expansion. They go kind of like, if prices go up, that's inflation, or like they are talking about even wars and other things that cause inflation. And they usually don't just put the finger on the thing that actually caused inflation, which is monetary expansion, which is super interesting to see that they kind of want to wash that away and kind of confuse people with many different theories. It's also kind of sad to see that there's so many misguided information.
So to interrupt, I think if you ask people on the street, 100 people on the street in most countries, Europe, America, Asia, elsewhere, what causes inflation? At an estimate, I would say definitely more than half of them would not say money printing. I'd say something like 80, 90, 95% would start saying things like oil prices or, wars and, certain geopolitical events, when really those are the symptom rather than the cause of it. So, yeah, I think that's one of the key breakthroughs to make is when the financial press and legacy media stop gaslighting everybody and just saying, inflation is caused by anything other than, or, there's also a lot of surprise inflation whenever the figures are announced. I think it was just yesterday in the States they announced 3%, and they said, it was higher than expected. It's like, bullshit. You guys knew exactly what to expect because you pushed the button which printed 3% more money.
Yeah. And it's and they kind of have to be surprised to the downside, I feel like, because they're printing a lot more money than we actually have inflation rate. so they print like 10% and then it says an inflation rate of 3%, and they're like, just that much. They have to be surprised to the downside because there's deflationary force, and then they also usually define what's in the basket of what they are calculating inflation. Like it's a deep rabbit hole that broke a lot of thinking barriers for me once I discovered it. I'm like what? Because I never questioned inflation as CPI. Like for me, inflation was always CPI. Even when I was investing in stocks, and I was actually successful in the stock market before Bitcoin. So I was like, inflation is CPI, and you kind of are in this fiat mindset, and then you just keep going with that. And once someone breaks that, it's really powerful.
These figures that are fed to people by the media. I mean, another one is GDP. That makes not a bit of difference to people's lives. I live in Spain, and at the moment, Spain is being heralded as an economic wonder because its GDP is growing by sort of 0.5%, whereas other European nations are not. And everybody's saying, hey, what's Spain doing differently? You come and speak to people on the street and say, is your life, 0.5% better than last year? No. Like, they're not seeing that growth. They're not seeing that increase in wealth. It's just a number which, tracks overall production. And that does not help most people who are working a 9 to 5. They're seeing significant inflation and getting poorer every year and looking around saying, what's going on? Why do I have to work harder? And, I think that's another thing that we need to break is the reliance on these old metrics, which are just not relevant to people on the street. That's how we can orange pill people saying, what is relevant to you? Well, think about that.
So painted. It's also, it's like they denominates the GDP obviously in a fiat currency. So of course it's growing. Like,
exactly.
You devalue the fiat currency, like it can only go up. Like we can only grow. And it's actually really interesting. When I was in and I remember that they actually, weirdly enough, like 5-6 years ago when I was in school, and it was known to people that I was in stocks, and I was researching a lot in there. It was like the beginning of my investing career. I was like 18, 19 years old, and a school colleague came up to me and said like, oh, why is it actually that the economy grows every year? Like, why are we getting bigger every year? And I never had the answer to that. And then I'm like, yeah, like if we are Earth, like Earth is always Earth, like we always have like, we are maybe getting more humans. So like there's like the human population gets better. We're getting more efficient in things. But is that really growing anything? Like what does that, like, what is the number that manifests that? And what I was not knowing back then was like the number that we are valuing that growth in is devaluing, and therefore the number is obviously growing. And just because the GDP is growing with 5% doesn't mean we are growing 5%. It's probably we're actually having less and less. But there is this deflation where, and also I think we're getting in general a little bit more wealthier if you look at if you zoom out long enough. Because if you look now, like probably most of the viewers here could get on a plane and could fly to another country. And if you just look back like 100, 200 years, not the richest man alive couldn't do that. Like if you look back long enough, all the things that we are now doing on like a normal basis, the richest man alive at some point couldn't do that in the history. So we're getting wealthier. We can do more things, but we're not like really growing. Like, I don't know what the metric for growing in that sense would be.
I mean, I really love Jeff Booth's work, and when he talks about stuff like this, because, we're getting more wealthy or rich in the sense that we can buy a microwave for $40, whereas, 50 years ago it cost thousands, and people couldn't afford it. So in terms of technology, it's so deflationary that we're experiencing massive gains and abundance. But if you could remove the fiat economy from that, we'd be experiencing, or if you could change the fiat economy rather, we'd be experiencing that abundance tenfold, or certainly in other aspects of life as well. It's like in a way, we might have more stuff, we might have bigger TVs, but are we healthier and happier and doing better? I don't know. So there's a quality aspect to it as well, I think.
What do you think is the story to break through in the mainstream? If we look, like you made a Star Trek or Star Wars, I've never watched any of those. So I don't even know what the differences. Don't get mad at me. But like a story where they describe the problems without describing the problems really, and just showing them with a story. Something that could get real mainstream, that shows the Bitcoin, that shows the problem of money printing. If you had to guess, like what kind of story would that be? Would that a personal story following a human being? Would that like a fictional science fiction in the future story? Like how would it be possible to make basically what we have in the big print in a really nice story that doesn't even mention Bitcoin? That's kind of like my thought right now.
Good question. I suppose like what 1984 is for surveillance and totalitarian, government overreach, for the world of finance. I mean, I hope that we will see a big bestseller like that, or a big movie which comes out and blows the lid off the difficulties of our financial system. I mean, in reality, I think there's so many different approaches and ways that this idea spreads to become the norm. Part of that is through acceptance by traditional media, and TradFi is sort of getting on board now. We're going to see more financial press posting at least balanced articles rather than stupid articles saying that Bitcoin uses too much energy or things like that. And it's still a massive grassroots movement, of course. There's so many people like myself who come on board and think of new and powerful ways to do work and spread the message, and it becomes very meaningful for me and the others who read or listen or consume this work. Yeah, as for what will be I don't think there'll be necessarily one massive blockbuster or breakthrough that suddenly makes everyone realize, because, hey, 1984 was written, post World War II, saying, there are dangers of government expansion and overreach. And it's still a more important book now almost than when it was written, even though it was written as a Cold War sort of argument against totalitarianism. We're experiencing that more and more, the eyes of Big Brother on us. So, and I just wanted to mention as well, in terms of a bestseller, there have been books which, are starting to legitimize Bitcoin in the fiction world as well. I know Seyfried Amos is going to release his fiction book very soon. Lynn Alden's been talking about writing a fiction book. And last year, there was, in February, I think, a thriller writer called Steve Berry, who's an American. He's written dozens of books and is a kind of bestseller. And he released a book called The Atlas Maneuver, which is a thriller with a split timeline. And I think at least half of it is directly about sort of cryptography and Bitcoin. And that in itself means people in a book group are talking about Bitcoin, learning, but what is this? Why do we need it? And why was it in this story? People in the New York Times are writing reviews about that book. It's comes from many angles. So it can be blockbusters, it can be grassroots movements, it can be through top-down instruction. And, the day we see in a publication like the New York Times, like a guide to, self-custody or something, we'll know we've made mainstream adoption. But until then, I think it's going to come from many different angles, and there's many ways to tell stories and to influence people.
Yeah, and it is kind of we have to get to as many different angles, and then also we increase the odds of one just going extremely viral, like one just blowing out of the shelves, and like that's an amazing story and everyone likes it a lot. But I do think we need those really great stories to get through. I don't think we needed it necessarily, but I do think we get it over the long run, where we actually get to see all those amazing stories written on those great textbooks, and we're getting really flooded over the masses. So I'm looking forward to those things, and we already kind of have them, like the Bitcoin standard, and let's see where the book from Larry now goes with the big print. I think he has a lot of those have a lot of potential to hit a mainstream and hit some other interests, but mainstream maybe in the finance space, which maybe is also the most important for Bitcoin, because I think like mainstream adoption probably comes from people use it without even knowing. A similar way of people use the TCP/IP protocol without even knowing what the heck that is. They use a car without really knowing what an engine is, or like how to describe an engine and stuff like that. So maybe that's also, maybe we don't even need to educate people on Bitcoin, more like make them aware of it and make them comfortable with Bitcoin and the applications on top of it and the ecosystem and the implications from that.
I mean, there's so many different things we haven't even talked about, like you said, spreading through, making it easy, making it possible. And there's a lot of great work in the tech world where people and companies are building apps and solutions and platforms which remove the barriers that have been put up. But I think we're at 5-6% adoption, or where the internet was in 1999, 2000. There were still people back then saying, why do I need the internet? There are still people who, even now, like very few, but are still sort of refusing to get on board with the digital world. So I guess if you track that, it's going to be another 20, 25 years until we're at the point of almost total coverage. And everybody needs to keep spreading the news, but putting in their work to make it happen, be it in the world of development, in the world of finance, in the world of media, in the world of content creation or stories or whatever it is. I think there's a lot of different angles to it. I just hope that what I do is allowing people to spread a story rather than spread Bitcoin, and that may be the seed of an idea, but if it takes root, then it can really help humanity to heal and get better.
Absolutely, yeah. Super interesting. How has we talked about it before, and I'm really curious about that because we talked about social media and the implications for authors. But how has, in general, in the last 10, 15 years, 20 years, however long you want to go back, writing books and being an author have changed over the years?
I mean, huge changes, and I think there are people who are not able to keep pace with the change, and change is getting faster. So, if you look back to the 1990s, very few people were getting published. Very few people were article writers in magazines or were publishing books, because there was a hard line of gatekeepers, the publishers like Penguin Random House or Hachette, who were saying yes to you and no to you. And that's also why we weren't getting a very diverse set of works. Right, we were getting them saying, "Oh well, people like these kinds of stories from these kinds of people, so we'll keep putting them out." With self-publishing and the internet, that led to opening of the gates. Anyone could publish. There's a good and a bad to that. What's great is we did get a lot of new ideas, which are maybe non-mainstream ideas or from people who didn't have a voice before. But we also get millions and millions of books, many of them which are crap, many of them which will never sell a copy. And authors had to navigate that. I think now self-publishing is accepted as totally normal. It's the best option for many people. Larry Levard self-published his book or published it via Amazon, he doesn't need, the backing of a major publisher because he's built his audience. So I think that's through his years of work in finance, I should say, and his media presence. So I guess that's a big change. Learning about self-publishing, that becoming accepted, learning that you have to build an audience in order to sell books or to sell your writing. And then the next greatest change, of course, a few years ago was AI and what that means for writers. So I think that it's a very fast changing landscape. There are a lot of pluses and minuses. I think it's hard to earn a living as a writer. It's hard to sell books. It's hard to find maybe a great writing job. If you want money, it's probably better professions to go into. But that said, I think human writing is something that I value a lot, and I really stake my reputation on writing for humans. I mean, essentially, it doesn't matter who writes, but if a machine can write something which is valuable by humans, great. But I think that human writers such as myself should focus on the kinds of texts that only we can produce. Personal opinion, experience, stories, things like that, which machines are not very good at. So that's been a great change, which we have to navigate. But I believe that human writing will continue. I believe that books will continue to be incredibly important. And I think Bitcoin is such a fantastic example of like a niche publishing industry with so many books. Bitcoin is read so many books, and that's most people don't. So that's great. But yeah, I think books will continue to be important, and they express ideas really perfectly and stories really well. So I think we won't see the demise of the concept of the book. It may change a bit, and we might be doing more multimedia stuff. But yeah, sorry to ramble on. But as in terms of writing, we've seen lots of changes, and there's going to be more. But writing and human writing will always be.
What do you feel like is you mentioned a little bit the AI influence of that, and the human should focus on human stories. But I think like for textbooks, AI is probably already very good. I not tried it yet. I asked actually, that's how I came to some articles, ideas, and things like that. I put all the transcripts of my podcast into ChatGPT and just asking, hey, like what are interesting topics? What are like directions of articles, and what are kind of the key learnings from the podcast? Because it's just impossible for a human brain to watch 400 podcasts and process that. But it's possible for AI. And there was so much text and so many great lines coming out. And I was like, wow, that's written well, because AI uses how the speaker of the podcast spoke that and just like used those sentences and it phrased it really well. And I'm like, oh, like that could be, if I put a lot of effort in there with AI and kind of craft it, probably I can write a textbook around Bitcoin with the help of like 400 transcripts of 400 different Bitcoin things. I'm like, oh, like this completely changes how we think about content in general. It's not only books, because like it will only be a matter of time till I could only be an AI character, and you probably don't even know who's the real Robin and who's the AI Robin. We're coming closer to that, but right now it's still kind of like you can tell which one is the AI video if you put the original and the other one next to each other, but it gets closer and closer.
Yeah, things are changing, and this may age badly, saying, "Oh, AI will never be able to write a good novel." Of course, it will improve. I think a lot of the focus in the last couple of years has been people being impressed about what it can do, because it has a computing power and a brain so far ahead of humans. It is impressive, but in terms of the value that you bring to the table as a writer or a creator, AI would be pretty impressed about the stuff you can do that it can't. and it's a machine, right? That you feed things into it, it does its work, and it puts something else out, which is a product of everything that's gone in. And humans can create things where there has been no input. And I think that's the impressive thing. There's been certainly no digital input. So, in my work, if I'm writing writing about a business experience for a founder, I can tell their story based on what they've told me, what I can glean from the information, the little information that's available. But it can be some kind of narrative or lesson can be created out of what is not there. And I think machines can't do that. They are great at passing huge amounts of information and regurgitating it in a clearer way. With your idea about a book, you'd certainly get something which is manageable and useful. In terms of writing the best book, it would be finding the creative mechanic which sparks people's interests. Things like the big print is a great example of a title with a hook, and it relies on people's knowledge of things like The Big Short and films and other stories that have happened. I think that's a good way of humans can frame experiences and data in a way that other humans care about and other humans are interested in. Machines can maybe learn that over time, but we'll always want nuance and difference and change. Again, going back to language, if you look at how language changes, it's counterculture. And the one thing AI cannot do is counterculture. It can only do mainstream culture because it says all of the stuff that's been put in, this is the most common, this is the most frequent, this is the most accepted, this is the most verifiable. I'm going to go with that. But, it can never create something which is edgy or thinking outside the box.
That's interesting. I kind of think, now I'm really just thinking out loud, but it probably will do the same thing as the printing press and social media has done. It will probably enable a lot more writing and a bigger flow of information. But there's this saying in marketing and also in selling is humans want to buy from humans. And I think humans want to love humans. Human wants to hear something from other humans. So I do think AI will be highly integrated in especially in textbooks. I don't know, maybe even in storybooks. But at the end of the day, it's probably the uniqueness that a human can give the special touch on top of it. But it's really interesting to think about what AI, because we are just at the real starting point of that AI thing of it's like the first 5 years of social media, like 2012 on YouTube. When did YouTube come out? 2010, 8 or something like that, or 5 even. So that's super interesting to think about. How does this look in 10 years when those exponential growth curves set in?
I think it's generational as well. If you think about smartphones, there are people who are sort of 75 now, let's say, who never accepted a smartphone. That it came just too late for them, and they thought, I've got 10, 20 years of life left. I'm not going to bother learning it. And they never accept that, everyone around the dinner table is looking at their phone and interacting. They just think that's totally unacceptable. And they've never accepted it. But kids who are born now get a smartphone when they're 8 years old or whatever, and that's totally the norm for their whole life. So they accept it. I think the same will happen with AI. For me, I will never accept machine-written stories. They won't be meaningful to me. When I read a story, I'm connecting not only with the characters and other readers, but with the author and the writer whose experience shaped it. maybe in 50 years or maybe even in 20 years, kids who grew up with AI will be happy to go to the movies and watch a movie that was written by AI, acted by AI, and directed by AI, and it will just be the norm. That's quite possible. But I think for millennials and Gen Xers and boomers, we'll never get there. Maybe the next generation will.
Interesting. Maybe a selfish question. If I were to write a book, what kind of tips you have, as you also have a channel around that? What kind of tips do you have for me as someone that is actually non-English speaking, but I do a lot of, most of my time now I speak English. It almost feels like I'm native, but with a weird accent. And I've never written. And as you know, from the thing I told you before, I was actually failing English and German classes. I was never good in writing anything.
I suppose it depends on your time preference. If your objective is to really, improve your English and your writing to a level where it's very high level, accepted, a very proficient level of language, then different forms of study, working with colleagues, coaches, tutors, editors and being part of a community as well will usually help you work towards like a long-term goal like that. As with a book, I think many people want to have a book because it sort of is a representation of their personality and work and ideas. That's great. I think it's totally valid. In terms of writing a book, you need to be doing it for yourself. You need to love the process, and you want to write that book for yourself. You want it to include the things that express who you are. But you also need to bear in mind you're not the consumer of the book. Hopefully, other people are. So you also need to bear in mind that people reading the book need to get something from it, and that if it's a book that you want to sell, publish, or get out into the world, then it's a product at the end of the day. So we go back to Bitcoin books. If you write a book about this is what I think about Bitcoin, so, well, okay, but how many of those books have we had? So my advice for any writers in the Bitcoin space who are putting out books or thinking about longer form writing is do it for yourself, but also consider that you're writing as a product and it needs to be something nuanced, different, new, and exciting to people. You have to sell what you're doing. I think that's another big change in writing now, is that you spend a lot of time selling, even if it's just your own writing, you're selling it, rather than just, Ernest Hemingway could drink 4 glasses of rum and sit down at his typewriter and do whatever the hell he wanted, and his publisher would eventually say, have you got a manuscript? I think now you've got to plan things and execute in terms of the production and the selling of your writing.
Yeah, that's interesting. And what I will 100% do is just write it for myself, because I think that's really valuable. Even if I just look at figuring out what I'm thinking about Bitcoin and where my thoughts are. I even asked Larry yesterday the question of how did writing the book influence your thinking of Bitcoin? And he mentioned some things that actually profounded his view on Bitcoin just with the process of writing, because then you were like, oh, I actually have that small topic inside there. I have to research. I have to actually look up, because I always took it as a given, but now I'm writing it down. I want to put it out in the world. Now I really have to study that thing in detail. And so that's just a process that I definitely want. Maybe I'm just making a PDF and say if you want to read it, here it is. But I have to the point right now, because I know it's a lot of work, and right now no intentions of selling and publishing a book, because I think it is a lot of planning and selling. But I definitely will craft my thoughts better with writing the book. And if there's something out there where I'm like, okay, I could put those thoughts that are written down maybe in something nice that people actually value and people actually have an advantage of, maybe then I go ahead. But I don't expect anything this year.
There are so many different forms of publishing. I mean, we're quite focused on books in Bitcoin because complex ideas often need that wraparound concept of a book. But there are so many great ways to publish, on like a sort of newsletter style, like Substack, those kind of publications. As you say, like PDFs, guides, audiobooks, podcasts, just animations. There's so many different ways that you can express that, or even just, I think a lot of the Bitcoin community is moving towards like micro blogging, like meaningful, decent posts on X or Nostr are something which is, especially with Nostr, is like a proof of work and will be there for a long time and can actually accrue value. So a couple of questions before getting into book writing as well is like, does this need to be a book? Would this be best expressed as a book? And the second question would be like, why should people care about this? If you can't answer those questions very easily, then maybe you need to think about other options.
Does it need to be a book? Maybe it's also like a sequence of articles that you can just put out. Like you don't have to put it in a book, or like even you can express the same thoughts in a book that you can also do maybe like in a 1 hour video, and just like sitting down and expressing what you think about that, and just like talking about it 1 hour long if you're more comfortable like me in front of the camera as in front of a pen. I am really.
I run into so many people who say, oh, you're a writer. Oh, I'm writing a book. Or, oh, I want to write a book. And I say, okay, great. What's it about? And they say, me, my life. I've had a crazy life, or I've had an interesting life. If you ask those two questions to those people, does it need to be a book? They say, probably not. Well, why is it book? Because I want a book. Because I want it to be, a book. So in a way, it's, that self-importance of social media. We all want that, to show that we're important and doing well. And, if you ask them, well, why would anybody care? They'd say, well, they probably wouldn't. So, well, why are you doing it then? That's what I would say. I should say as well that there are loads of people who have had amazing lives that are worthy of writing books. In fact, anyone's life is worthy of writing a book. But if you can't answer that question of like why people care, you haven't framed it in a way which is valuable enough for people to consume it as a product, essentially. So that's some of the thought process that you need to go to figure out if you're going to write a book or not.
Yeah, and then you that's the hard truth always about the free market then, because like you value it and you think it's very valuable for the people, and especially as a content creator, I know that a lot. Sometimes you're like, oh, that podcast episode is really good, and you put it out there, and the average view duration is down. People don't click on the title. Like people don't leave nice comments, and you're like, okay, I was the only one that thought that episode was really special. And sometimes you go through that theory of like, there is content that you like. It doesn't mean that everyone likes that content. It's okay to like, if you put out consistent content, no matter if it's writing a book is probably way more hard than like just having an X account, or like having a podcast, or having like some video channel or Instagram stories or whatever. If you put it out consistently for a long period of time and nobody views it and nobody interacts with that, it's probably because it sucks. And it's the hard truth. But you might still want to do it because maybe that's what you really enjoy, and it's like almost maybe therapy for yourself, and maybe it's important for you, or maybe it's important for some other aspect of your life without getting recognized or getting someone to buy a book or something like that. So like content can be very, very nice without having the business case of that That's
And there are many people who write for themselves and who just write because it's a great, expression. That's something we haven't talked about, and it's very true. I definitely encourage people to write and to journal and to write their own thoughts and to get things down. It's very helpful. But going back to what you said about whether content does well or not, well, there's quality and quantity. If you said to me, Phil, this was a very special episode of my podcast and it really meant a lot to me, that would be great. That would be, better for me than getting 1 million views. But, you also measure on terms of quantity as well, right? So you want to, see those metrics and assess like how things are doing well for me. That might be how much I get paid or whether a book sells or not. But I think you have to balance both because we do set ourselves up to fail in a world which is difficult to market stuff because everyone else is trying. In a free market, as you say, things can bomb for many reasons. So respect the quality of feedback that you get, as well as numerical, quantitative.
And the quantity doesn't necessarily say something about the quality, but it does has the aspect of like, if people really resonate with an episode, they are more likely to like send it to friends and send it around and make the podcast episode bigger than maybe usual. There's also like how those algorithms usually work is like they see if when they see the content, do they interact with it, and how long do they interact with that? That's like, if I have to describe all the algorithms out there in one sentence, that's basically the formula. Like, what do they do with the content when they see it, and how long do they do it with? In YouTube terms, for example, do they click on the title and the thumbnail, and how long do they watch the whole thing then? And this determines 90% of your success of an episode, and then like 10% of like sharing and other metrics. It does represent, the quantity does represent to some extent quality, but not always, because there are also things like who was in the thumbnail, who was in the podcast, because he's really famous, but he had a bad day and the podcast was actually really bad. So like it still got a lot of views because I don't know, like Elon Musk was in there or something like that, but it was actually not that valuable. Or was there someone that was completely unknown? Nobody knew him at all. This was his first podcast, but for some reason he was really good in speaking and he was really great as a podcast guest. And he did not good because nobody knew him and nobody clicked on it in the first place. So there are some valuable insights in the quantity, but with a lot of perspectives that you have to keep in mind of the platforms and the overall ecosystem. I would say I could talk way too long about social media and algorithms.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on it, but I've dabbled in all the social media apart from TikTok because that's just evil. But and had my share of algorithm successes, failures, and burnouts. So yeah, I could also go on about that for a while, but I'm certainly no YouTube expert like yourself.
Really good. Let's come to the end routine. Before the end routine, I have always one question that I ask each and every one of my guests, and the question is, what can we learn from you besides Bitcoin?
You can learn about writing your best words as a multilingual writer. We mentioned at the start that I have a background in being a language and writing coach for pro writers. So if you want to talk to me about joining my community as a multilingual writer or, editing work, then get in touch. And you can also learn just about different characters and people and places in the world from my own fiction, from my own books. So yeah, if you want to get in touch with me via 21 Futures stuff, you can find social accounts for 21 Futures or 21futures.com. And if you want to get in touch with me in terms of my Bitcoin writing, visit totallyhumanwriter.com.
Really cool. Thank you so much. We have one more end routine where the previous guest is asking a question for the next guest without knowing who the next guest actually is. And the question for you, completely a different topic now, but that's the beauty of that end routine. It brings something new in the podcast. How long do you think it will take till the European Union disintegrates? And maybe before the question should be, do you even think that the EU will fail?
I mean, everything will come to an end eventually, right? Including the planet. But the EU, I'd say in the next 20 to 30 years, I would expect it to look different. I can't tell you exactly how, but I think changes in geopolitics and monetary systems will have a massive part to play in the changing nature of the nation state. So I do think it will be smashed apart in the next 20 to 30 years.
Oh, really interesting. Perfect. And thank you so much, Philip, for being on the show. I usually ask where people can find you and ask you questions, but you already gave us the answers. Not too soon, a little bit sooner. But thank you so much for being on the show. It was a real pleasure to talk with you. And also thank you so much for everyone that is watching and listening for joining us today. As always, I'll be back tomorrow with another episode. Bye-bye.